Good evening, everybody. If you're involved in a good discussion, just keep it going. If you need something to get the pump primed, how about New Year's resolutions? If you have one, share it with your group. Talk to them about how you're going to keep it. And if you don't have one, no, talk about why you don't have one. It's okay if you don't have one. All right, be it resolved. It is 2024, and we will do good things for the Lord, whatever they are. All right. We're going to get into it this evening. No questions for investigation. We are at the end of an era. January 4th, 2023, we started Elba. January 3rd, 2024, less than a year later, we are finished with what? Yeah, with the entire Torah or Pentateuch, the first 5 books, the first section of books. So it's only taken us 1 year. It is pretty good. You know, when Pastor Jeff asked me, when we were talking about this initially, this Elba idea, and he was saying, well, what do you think the pace or whatever? I said, well, I would say 3 to 5 years to go through the Old Testament. And he's like, oh. Well, if you do the math, 5 books out of 39 Old Testament books, that doesn't sound like much, but if you count the number of chapters, we've covered 20% of the chapters of the Old Testament. So we're further along than it might seem, because we've covered a lot of ground in those first 5 books. And so a couple things upcoming. I don't have a lot to share in terms of upcoming, but just to wet the whistle, I guess. Obviously, we're going to be getting into Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. In March, we'll have something very special. I guess I can preview it. We're going to have March Gladness. For those that have any experience with college basketball, March Madness, we're going to have March Gladness. We're going to have brackets with all kinds of stuff. It's going to be fun. Anyway, that's March. I'm excited about that. I've been holding that in my pocket for 4 months. So yeah, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. Pastor Jeff will pick back up with 1st and 2nd Samuel, and so that'll be, by that time it'll be nice and warm outside for those that like warm things. But anyway, that's what's coming. But we're going to wrap up Deuteronomy and wrap up the Torah tonight. We will do questions at the end because it is the last week of, the last lesson of a whole section. And so we'll go right into the topic tonight. The reading was Deuteronomy chapter 27 through 34. And we talked about in the previous 2 sessions how Deuteronomy can be thought of or understood as a treaty, which has 3 parts. And so God and the Israelites are entering into covenant again. They're ratifying the covenant the second time, and it's going to stick this time, sort of. And in that treaty, in those 3 sermons by Moses, he is laying out the 3 parts of the treaty, which are, first is the history. In other words, this is the history of the relationship between God and Israel. This is what I have done for you as your king. The second part being the terms of the covenant. Here's what I expect you to do, and here's what I expect you to not do. We discussed that at length. That's the longest part of the book. That was the part that we talked about in the last session. And then this last session tonight primarily deals with the 3rd part of the treaty, which is the consequences. What happens when you do what you're supposed to do, and then what happens when you don't do what you're supposed to do. In other words, that king is saying to the people that he's entering into treaty with, here's what you can expect if you don't do what you're supposed to do, but also here's what you can expect of me if you hold up your end of the covenant. And so another way to say that is blessing and cursing. And we get into that for sure in chapter 28. But we're starting in chapter 27. And the beginning of Moses' 3rd sermon, at least one commentator thinks that this actually goes with the first sermon. But whatever. It says at the beginning of chapter 27, Moses and the elders of Israel commanded the people. And so we talked about how Moses is talking to a select group of people, and then they go and spread the word to the rest of the people, because he can't talk to 2 million people at one time. They didn't have microphones. Okay. This is a 2-step process. In other words, he's saying it to them, and then they relay that message to the people. Here is that message in chapter 27, verses 1 through 8. He says, when you cross over the Jordan, you're going to go to Mount Ebal, E-B-A-L, Ebal, and set up stones and inscribe the words of the law. So you're going to make sure that the words of the law that's been given are written down and is inscribed on the stones. Verse 9, Moses and the Levitical priests spoke to all Israel. So a different, new, these people are talking to these people. And what they say is, obey, okay? Obey what God has laid out here, and it will go well with you. Verse 11, Moses commanded the people. On that day, Moses commanded the people. So I'm making a point of this because beginning at verse 11, Moses is saying to the people, here's what you're going to do. Again, he's been saying this the whole time we've been in Deuteronomy. Here's what the Lord says. But that beginning in verse 11 and 27, we'll talk about what he says in a second. But it goes all the way through chapter 28. Again, the chapter divisions aren't there in the original. The end of chapter 27, if you have a paper Bible, even an e-Bible, you might see the difference between poetry and prose, okay? At the end of chapter 27 is all poetic, and the beginning of chapter 28, it's in prose. But there's no, at the beginning of chapter 28, there's no additional statement, and then Moses said this. In other words, 28 flows right out of 27. There's no break there, okay? So the beginning of what Moses says to the people is verse 11 of chapter 27. And what he says is, you're going to cross the Jordan River. Of course, I won't be with you. And you're going to go to these two mountains, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. And let me go ahead and show you a picture. If you have your phones and have gotten into the deal here. By the way, anybody that doesn't have a device and needs one, Sam can supply you if you raise your hand and you want a tablet to get into the presentation. But anyway, you can see it here on the screen, but you can also blow it up there on your device. The fuchsia magenta color is Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. It is north of where they are stationed currently. Remember, the Israelites are on the east side of the Jordan River, around about where that blue circle is, right at the north edge of the Dead Sea. And so they're going to cross the river. They're going to go to these two mountains, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. These mountains are about 2 miles from each other. Okay? And so 6 of the tribes are going to get on one mountain, and the other 6 tribes are going to get on the other mountain, and they're going to talk to each other. They're going to say, the 6 tribes on Mount Gerizim are going to articulate the blessings. And the 6 tribes on Mount Ebal are going to articulate the curses. And so once again, we just have a reiteration of keep this in front of you. Don't forget the blessings that will come with obedience. Don't forget the curses that will come with disobedience. Again, he goes into, in the tail end of chapter 27, kind of Cliff's Notes of the law. Just a short version of the law that we've been hearing about for many weeks in poetic form. When chapter 28 begins, it goes into prose, but again, it's a continuation of exactly what he had been saying there. But Deuteronomy 28 is a really important chapter. It is the focus and the centerpiece of this whole passage. It is the chapter of chapters when it comes to articulating the blessings and the curses. The first 14 verses of Deuteronomy 28 is the blessing. If you obey, here's what you can expect from me, God. If you disobey, many more verses, verses 15 through 68, here's what you can expect if you disobey, and it's curse. And if you read that this week, or at any time you've ever read that, it's one of the bleakest chapters, or the half chapter, in the Bible. There's some real tough stuff there. And this is God talking to his people. And it's really sad to see. Here's what will happen if you go this way. And so Deuteronomy 28 is the focal point of the conditional nature of this covenant that we've talked about before. God's covenant with Abraham, unconditional, unilateral, God's going to do it. God's covenant with Israel, it's conditional, It is based on them keeping up their end. And so if they do right, they'll have blessing. If they don't do right, they'll have curse. And we'll find out in chapter 30 that God knows in advance what they're going to do. Okay, chapter 29 comes first, though. Chapter 29 is a little bit more of that history type thing, the first part of the treaty. Here's what God did in the past. You remember what happened with the Egyptians. You remember what happened in the wilderness. Don't forget these things. Therefore, do what you're supposed to do. Basically, that's the message of chapter 29. Verses 9 through 15, observe the covenant. Because you know what happened back then, make sure you observe the covenant. Verses 16 through 29, don't abandon the covenant. Okay, chapter 30 begins with a very ominous word. And that word is when. After all this talk about if you do this and if you do that, chapter 30 starts with, when you mess up, the curses are going to come. Not if. And again, it shows you that God knows in advance what's going to happen. Of course he does. But, I mean, it's just sad. It's going to happen. And if you were listening to that, your ears should have perked up and said, oh my goodness, why did he just say when? Give me an if. No, it's a when. But it's not just when you leave me, God is saying, curses will come. But also, when that happens, you will come to your senses as a people, notice. And I want to make a point later about the difference between individuals and the group. The nation of Israel as a group is called by God. And they are his people. But not every single person makes it. And so we need to be careful sometimes when we're making theological positions that we need to understand what is the group and what is the individual. Because God can keep his promises to his people as a group, and individual people can still not be a part of that because they choose to go a different way. But anyway, chapter 30, when you turn away, bad things are going to happen. But then when you come to your senses as a group of people and say, oh, we've left the Lord, let's come back. And Moses is saying on behalf of God, when that happens, I will have compassion on you. I will restore you. I will restore your fortunes. So overall, chapter 30 is a pretty positive chapter. It ends, of course, with the climax of really the entire book. We know this verse. I would say most of the people in here, when I say choose life, you've heard that before, you know. And we pick it kind of out of context, you know. I set before you, Moses is saying this on behalf of God, I'm setting before you today a choice between life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life. And we know that, right? In other words, we've heard that passage before. Well, this is where it goes. It goes at the end of chapter 30 of Deuteronomy. After all of these 29 chapters of really saying the same thing over and over. Here's what you're supposed to do. Do it and it'll go well. Don't do it, it won't go well. Therefore, choose life. This is the climax. And as has been noted by many people over the years, he doesn't say just choose. He says choose life. In other words, God is saying, this is what I want you to choose. And we'll come back and talk more about this in the second look segment. But that's really, again, the climax. And that's where the sermon ends. And we get 4 more chapters then, chapters 31, 2, 3, and 4, that give us the so-called falling action and resolution. If you think in terms of a book or movie, a plot, 5 parts of the plot, the exposition, and then the rising action, and then the climax, and then the falling action and the resolution. Well, chapters 31, 32, 33, and 34 is the falling action and the resolution. In other words, we've gotten to the climax where Moses says, choose life. And now we get 4 chapters at the end of this book that kind of just ease us into the end of the story. The end of the story of the first 5 books. Remember, these 5 books together make, in the Hebrew mind for sure, a section that is just by itself. It is not connected to the other parts. And this is the end of that section. So falling action and resolution looks a little bit like this. Chapter 31, Joshua takes Moses' place as leader of the people. Moses writes out the law in a book form, which essentially we now know as the Torah. He writes out the law in book form, and he instructs the Israelites that that book of the law is to be kept next to the Ark of the Covenant. Chapter 32, the Song of Moses. 120 years old, going to die tomorrow. Let me sing a song to you guys, okay? The Song of Moses, all right? And we call these things, by the way, I don't remember if I talked about this before, maybe I did, but the canticles. Canticles is the word that's used to describe songs in the Bible, Old and New Testament, usually not the Psalms. So you have the Psalms, and then other songs that appear throughout the Scriptures are called the canticles, sometimes referred to as greater and lesser canticles, greater being the songs of the New Testament. Anybody can give me some examples of songs in the New Testament? Mary's song. Paul had a couple in his writings. If you look through Paul's epistles and then all of a sudden you see something that looks like a poem as opposed to prose, like he's writing a letter, that's probably a canticle. That's a psalm, yeah. Yeah, others too. So Zechariah has one, Zacharias, and so forth. Anyway, in the Old Testament, the lesser canticles, Moses already had one, actually. This is Moses' second song. I actually wanted to bring a little prize for anybody that can tell me this, but I don't think I have any. I don't have any money or anything. No prize. You get the prize of being impressive to the rest of your peers. Anybody that can tell me what chapter of the Bible, Moses' other song, first song that we've already studied, book and chapter. Exodus is correct. So close. 15, yeah, 15. Yeah, after they cross the Red Sea, Moses sings a song, and then Miriam picks up and sings and plays tambourine. Anyway, these are called canticles. Some Christian traditions, services, denominations sing these things in church. These canticles, that's part of what they do as their worship service. Anyway, the Song of Moses, chapter 32. Chapter 33, Moses blesses the 12 tribes. This is very similar to what? That we've seen already. At the end of another book, Jacob blesses his 12 children. And now Moses comes along and blesses the 12 tribes. It looks very similar to the end of Genesis there. And then finally, chapter 34, a short chapter, where Moses climbs up Mount Nebo and dies. And he climbs up Mount Nebo, and God tells him, he shows him the land. He says, this is the land I promised to your forefathers. You're not going to go in, but I wanted you to see it. This is what they're going to get, and I'm going to stick with my word that this is going to happen. And then Joshua died. Let me read to you the very last few verses of the book of Deuteronomy, beginning in verse 9 of chapter 34. I just want you to hear how the Bible describes Moses here at the end of this book. Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. No prophet has arisen again in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unparalleled for all the signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do against the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh, to all his officials, and to all his land, and for all the mighty acts of power and terrifying deeds that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. So the Bible speaks very highly of this fellow Moses, the chief character of the books of Exodus through Deuteronomy. And with that, we're finished with Deuteronomy, except for exercise, second look, and application. All right? So we'll do an exercise tonight. Guys, is Sherry here? There she is. Got Sherry's favorite tonight. Got the crossword. Yeah, it's been a while since we did a crossword. Sorry, Sherry. Everybody else likes it, so. One per two people. There's two there, I think. If you can give one to. Check. Okay. Yeah, overtake is the answer. And again, the point there is that I wanted to bring out is the blessings overtake you. When you're obedient, blessings overtake you. It's not just that they're just there, but they are actively pursuing you and overtaking you. I think that's a come on Jesus there. Okay. Number 11 across, I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life. The reference is 30:19. 13 across, the command is not too difficult or beyond your reach. I think New King James says far off. Okay. 14, the secret. New King James says secret. CSB says hidden. The secret things belong to the Lord, but the revealed things belong to us and to our children forever. That's 29:29. Okay, down. Their blank is not like our blank. Yeah, you got it. It's 32:31 is the reference. Their rock is not like our rock. Their rock with a lowercase r is not like our rock with an uppercase r. That's a pretty cool line. 3 down, the 2 tribes who received the shortest of Moses' blessings. Dan and Reuben, that's right. Dan's blessing was 6 Hebrew words, and Reuben's blessing was 9 Hebrew words. And Reuben's blessing was not much of a blessing. It was more of like a, hope you make it. Chapter 33, that one was. The mountain Moses died on. Nebo 34:1. Okay. 5 down, what were they to set up? Altar of stones. That's right, altar of stones. That's chapter 27, verse 5. 6 down, pay attention or give ear. Heavens. Listen up, heavens, and I will speak. 8 down, what Moses faced as he looked over the promised land. Bible says it is Jericho. See next week. 12 down, the mountain where the curses will be pronounced. The reference is 27:13, and it is, Eval. You pronounce it with a V sound. Well, why don't they just say V? I don't know. Okay. All right, cool. Well, let's go second look here, if I can get my stuff together. We good? Oh, by the way, I skipped this in the previous. The blue circle is Mount Nebo. AKA that's basically where they were camped, more or less. So Moses goes up Mount Nebo and looks across the river, and there's Jericho right there. Jericho is right across the river on the north side of the Dead Sea. Okay, and you can see where Mount Gerizim and Mount Eval are north of that. Okay, so second look segment. I'm mostly going to just read scripture and make a couple points here, but I wanted to show you where some of these passages in Deuteronomy show up in the New Testament, as we have been doing mostly when we do the second look segment. And there's a lot that shows up in the book of Romans, from specifically Deuteronomy 29 and 30. So let's take a look here. I know you probably can't see that on the screen, but maybe you can blow it up on your device. But I'll read it either way. And I'm going to read it from the paper Bible. And it should be pretty similar to what you see there. Deuteronomy 29, beginning in verse 16, Moses says this: "Indeed, you know how we lived in the land of Egypt and passed through the nations where you traveled. You saw their detestable images and idols made of wood, stone, silver, and gold, which were among them. Be sure there is no man, woman, clan, or tribe among you today whose heart turns away from the Lord our God to go and worship the gods of those nations. Be sure there is no root among you bearing poisonous and bitter fruit." So again, don't be deceived. That's number one. And turn back. Don't turn back. But I want you to see also this idea of the nation of Israel, who is called and who is the people of God, as a group. That doesn't go away. In other words, the group is God's people. and yet you will have individuals out of that group who do not make it. And we see that idea return in Romans 9, 10, and 11 very, very specifically. So he's saying to the people, don't turn away, okay? The people as a whole are going to make it in the end. But individual people, there might be many of them who don't make it. So don't be part of, don't be the individuals that don't make it and find yourself not being part of the whole, okay? Verse 19, continuing, this is 29:19. When someone hears the words of this oath, he may consider himself exempt, thinking, I will have peace, even though I follow my own stubborn heart. Again, this goes back to don't be deceived. Just because you are in the group, don't be deceived. Don't be deceived. This will lead to the destruction of the well-watered land as well as the dry land. The Lord will not be willing to forgive him. Oof. Let's look at what happens in Romans that parallels this. In Romans chapter 2 in particular. Romans chapter 1, as you know, Paul, writing to the Romans, starts with the bad news. The wrath of God is directed at every one of us because we've all sinned. And in beginning of chapter 2, Paul says, therefore, any one of you who judges without excuse, when you judge another, you condemn yourself if you, the judge, do the same things. This is what he's saying in Deuteronomy. Okay, you're the people of God, quote unquote. Don't just go off and do your own thing. You're going to find that being in that people of God circle didn't help you much because you went off and did your own thing. And this is kind of the message here of Romans 2. You condemn yourself if you do the same things. Verse 2, we know that God's judgment, this is Romans 2:2. We know that God's judgment on those who do such things is based on the truth. Do you really think any one of you who judges those things yet does the same thing that you will escape God's judgment? Or do you despise the riches of his kindness, restraint, and patience, not recognizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance? But because of the hardness of your heart and unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself in the day of wrath when God's righteous judgment is revealed. You see the parallel there? Okay, moving on to chapter 30 of Deuteronomy, the very next chapter. Okay, I want you to notice this little, and there's only one verse here. It's verse 6. We can look at, you should probably see this one on the screen, but it says, the Lord, your God, will circumcise your heart. This is Moses talking to the people. So we're talking about the Israelites back then. The Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the hearts of your descendants, and you will love him with all your heart and all your soul, so that you will live. This is the first that we're hearing about this idea of circumcision of the heart. When Paul talks about circumcision of the heart in that same chapter, Romans chapter 2, this is referring back to this Deuteronomy passage. This is where he gets it from. Because again, the Jewish people, the males of course, are to be circumcised according to the law, etc., etc., etc. And what does Paul say about that as he brings us into the new covenant, beginning Romans chapter 2, verse 25. For circumcision benefits you if you observe the law, but if you are a lawbreaker, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the law's requirements, will his uncircumcision not be counted as circumcision? A man who is physically uncircumcised but who fulfills the law will judge you who are a lawbreaker in spite of having the letter of the law in circumcision. For a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, and true circumcision is not something visible in the flesh. On the contrary, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly. A true Jew, a true Israelite, a true person of God, if we can say it that way, is one who is one inwardly. And circumcision is of the heart. This is Paul talking to the people of God in Rome, and by extension to us. And he's bringing us back to this part in Deuteronomy where for 4 books worth, well, more than that, it goes back to Genesis. We've had this idea of circumcision, but in the end of Deuteronomy, God brings out this idea of circumcision of the heart. And now in Romans, Paul brings it over and he says, yeah, real circumcision is circumcision of the heart. Which is to say, a revealing, a cutting away, allowing God to pierce your heart and reveal what's there, expose it, and turn it into what he wants it to be, to make you a new heart. It really is what it is. Okay, and then back to chapter 30 of Deuteronomy, and we get our passage that we said was the climax of the book, Choose Life. Let's read a little bit right before that. So this is Deuteronomy chapter 30, beginning in verse 11. This command that I give you today is certainly not too difficult or beyond your reach. It is not in heaven, so that you have to ask who will go up to heaven to get it for us and proclaim it to us so that we may follow it. And it is not across the sea, so that you will have to ask who will cross the sea, get it for us, and proclaim it to us so we may follow it. But the message is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, so that you may follow it. See, today I have set before you life and prosperity, death and adversity. And then a couple verses later, choose life. This passage is quoted by Paul in Romans chapter 10. Romans 10, in the middle of his, the part of the letter, Romans 9, 10, 11, the part of the letter that addresses Israel and how that works with the new system, the gospel and the new covenant, etc., etc. Romans chapter 10, Paul says this, quoting what we just read there. You'll hear all these little pieces that sound exactly like what we just read. It's because he's quoting it. Let's start in verse 4. Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. The end meaning the fulfillment. It all comes together in him. Okay? Verse 6, but the righteousness that comes from faith speaks like this. Do not say in your heart, who will go up to heaven? We just heard that, didn't we? That is, to bring Christ down. Or who will go into the abyss? That is, to bring Christ up from the dead. And so he's giving commentary on Deuteronomy here. This is what it really means. Okay? On the contrary, what does it say? The message is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. This is the message of faith that we proclaim. If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. What's the point here? The point is, it's easy. This is not hard. Deuteronomy 30, 11, 12, 13. It is not too difficult or beyond your reach. It's not in heaven, so you got to have somebody go up to heaven and get it for you. It's not across the sea, so it's easy. This is what Moses is saying to the Israelites. It is, the message is very near you. Verse 14, the message is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, so you may follow it. I've set before you life and prosperity. Okay, in chapter 10, Paul quotes it, and he says, this is not hard, people. It's not hard. You don't have to go up to heaven. You don't have to go into the abyss. The message is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. It's this easy. If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, that is, Jesus is Master. I'm going to obey. I'm going to do what he says. That's Lord. Otherwise, you just say, Lord, Lord, and he says, I never knew you. If you confess Jesus is Lord and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, I mean, come on, how much easier does it have to be, people? That's what Paul's saying. That's what Moses was saying. This is not hard. It doesn't mean the Christian life doesn't have challenges, but getting on the right team is not complicated. And Paul brings it over and says, what's not complicated about it is believe in Jesus. Amen? All right. Application. Let's go right there to choose life, okay? The principle of choosing life has not changed from the time of Moses to now. Life is attainable and choosing it is simple. Discuss the ways in which we choose life today, both on the grand scale, choosing life eternal in terms of a big decision, but also the daily life choices, the little decisions. Choosing life, what does that look like? Have a little conversation about that.